In order to understand why dopamine is important here is we need to understand what dopamine usually does. So as I said, it's a reinforcing neurotransmitter. What's going to happen is that we will eat some food, or we will have sex, or we will do something that our body needs to reinforce that behavior in order to effectively make us survive longer. If you imagine when you eat, if dopamine is released for something that will help you to survive and essentially gain weight, then, we're going to release more dopamine. This makes us feel good, and we think, you know what, I'm going to do that again. But like every neurochemical in the body, the brain can only handle so much. So if we are releasing out too much dopamine chronically, the body will adapt by basically blunting its actions throughout the body to a point via things like downregulating the production of receptors for dopamine. This is relevant when it comes to eating or anything else that is going to also stimulate the release of a neurotransmitter like dopamine. Essentially, if we are doing this too much, we are going to downregulate the actions of the neurotransmitter throughout the body. This basically means that we need more of the neurotransmitter to get the same effect. And so basically when it comes to food, we need to eat more of a certain food that is going to stimulate more dopamine, like basically packaged crap, in order to get the same effects that we usually would. Something else that can go on here too. What if you're just deficient in the amino acids required in order to synthesize dopamine? So many people will often say you don't actually need to ingest amino acids in order to be able to produce dopamine. And while that's half true, they're talking about tyrosine, which is a non-essential amino acid. This means you can make it in your body, you don't have to eat it. But what they may not realize is that tyrosine is actually synthesized from another precursor amino acid called phenylalanine, which is in fact essential in our diet. We have to eat it in order to be able to produce enough dopamine. So what happens if you're not able to produce enough dopamine in the first place? Well, then your body is going to be trying to tell you to do all those things that would usually give you a release of dopamine, like, for example, eating, binge eating, having sex, anything that is going to stimulate a release of dopamine and reinforce that behavior and give you that little bit of a nice feeling that you get when you have a dopamine release. Your body's going to tell you to do that more. So this might come out in things like addictive behaviors, like addictive eating, maybe looking at too much porn, things like that. So what I think is really interesting here is when you go on an animal-based diet, you're actually effectively, in a way, doing something that is becoming quite trendy now, you might not have heard of, called dopamine fasting. Now, this makes complete sense because, as I said with the first scenario, if you are releasing out too much dopamine chronically, the body will regulate this system by just blunting its effects throughout the body. So if you have more times in your day or throughout your week where you are deliberately avoiding the release of excessive dopamine, then you're essentially going to create a sensitive environment to it, much like what would happen if you are resensitizing to insulin. So what's interesting is when you're on an animal-based diet, you do tend to feel much more satiated between meals. So you've probably gone from having 7 meals a day, like is recommended in the dietary guidelines, to having maybe 2 to 3 at max. You might even be dabbling in some intermittent fasting, because you know how great that is for you as well, which is also going to help with essentially creating a dopamine fasting situation, because essentially you're not eating all the time. So your body is kind of having breaks where it's not releasing out so much dopamine. The last thing that I think is really important to note as well is that there are other things that can stimulate the release of dopamine. And what we are actually finding now is that it can be released quite heavily when we are watching social media. So it's also worthwhile keeping in mind that if you are scrolling through social media all day long, then you're also going to be releasing out dopamine. Other things like caffeine can also release out dopamine. So if you're sort of chronically just drinking caffeine all day long, you're also going to be effectively blunting this system. So having periods in the day where you are not releasing out dopamine, and also trying to make sure that your diet is rich in amino acids like phenylalanine, you're also going to be helping with the ability to produce dopamine in the first place. Where do we get this from? Well, we know that all the essential amino acids can be provided from animal meats, so it's worthwhile making sure they're in your diet. We also know that there are other cofactors that are, important for the production of neurotransmitters like magnesium, zinc, copper, etc., etc. So if you can get all of those from animal products, then that's obviously the way to go. If you're feeling like you are searching out behaviors that will release out dopamine, like addictive things.